Growing up in a middle-class family in Encino, California, Milken was a star student and the head of the cheerleading squad before going to Berkeley for his undergrad studies. After getting his MBA from the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania in 1970, Michael Milken began working at the investment bank, Drexel Burnham Lambert, and pioneered the use of high-yield bonds, or junk bonds, to finance the merger and acquisition mania during the 1980s. Bonds is just another name for debt that is issued by a government entity or a company. Rather than taking money from a bank, the debt is issued by the company to the buyer of the bond. These buyers can be institutions such as pension funds that take large chunks of the bond issuance, or can be bought in smaller units by the individual investors. In return for taking on the bond, the issuing entity makes periodic interest or coupon payments for a given rate. The company also eventually must repay the amount taken from the bondholder at the end of the bond's maturity. Bond can be of various grades, some issued by large, well-established companies which are called investment-grade bonds, and others by not-so-well-off companies. These are the ones that are called junk bonds. The financial difficulties that such companies faced made it impossible for them to get a loan from a bank to either fund operations or grow. Hence, the risk associated with buying such bonds is that the company whose debt you're taking on might not survive to pay the debt back to you. To compensate for this and to attract enough buyers for such bonds, the company has to offer a high rate of interest, much higher than what the well-established companies that issue their own bonds would pay you. Such companies are essentially asking you to hold junk and pay you a pretty penny while doing so. During the 1980s, yields on junk bonds averaged a coupon rate of almost 15%, meaning that you were getting paid $15 for every $100 of junk bonds bought. Apart from raising massive trading activity in the junk bond market, Milken is also credited for the creation of a highly confident letter. This was a document issued by Drexel to the company making the bond sale, expressing confidence in the bank's ability to be able to sell these bonds and obtain the funding for the issuing company. This was essentially the document that would pave the way for a bond issuance deal to go through. For any of the bonds issued or traded, Drexel would earn enormous fees from the companies. Milken individually earned over $550 million in 1987. And under Milken's leadership, Drexel became the top underwriter of junk bond offerings. By 1986, it commanded an incredible 60% share of the junk bond market. Now, these junk bonds should have been used to finance operations for the company issuing them, but instead, things took on a sinister turn. The 1980s was the period where an acquisition boom occurred. Investment companies had emerged whose sole purpose was to acquire companies, restructure them, and sell them off for a quick profit. These private equity firms would normally have to look for partners willing to pool money together to buy companies. But the junk bond market made their lives a whole lot easier. By issuing junk bonds promising high rates of returns, there was no shortage of buyers for such junk bonds. And this is where Milken came in. Using his network and issuing his highly confident letters, he was able to convince these private equity companies that he has buyers ready for these junk bonds, enabling them to fund these acquisitions. The deals, however, would be structured where the assets of the target company would be used as a guarantee for repayment of these bonds. Once the acquisition was completed, the private equities would get to work. And by this, I mean things like mass layoffs, corporate restructures, and finally asset stripping. Why was this done? Well, the debt had to be repaid, and the quick profit had to be made. What would be sadly left is a shell of what the acquired company was. In fact, these private equity firms came to be known as corporate raiders, pressuring shareholders and owners to sell their company to them, whether through offering to buy the company's shares at inflated prices or threats of hostile takeovers. There was also trouble brewing in the background that Milken may well have been aware of, but did not take too seriously. The Securities and Exchange Commission began investigating Drexel and Milken for a variety of LX securities laws violations and shady dealings, but did not have enough evidence to indict him. In the midst of the junk bond frenzy, Milken was allegedly feeding inside information on companies that were part of the junk bond deals to his cronies. and they would trade on that information illegally for huge profits. Essentially, these were kickbacks that Milken compensated his cronies for directing business through Drexel. The first domino to fall in the SEC investigation was another Drexel employee named Dennis Levine. He was one of the members of Milken's insider trading ring that actively used Milken's information for massive profits. The money he would make would be routed through a complex network of Swiss and Bahamian bank accounts. Because Levine would trade in US stocks, the banks would still use American brokers to buy and sell stocks on his instructions. It was mainly because of this that eventually the SEC was able to track down and indict Levine on securities fraud. Levine, however, was not about to go down alone. After pleading guilty, he agreed to cooperate with federal investigators for a reduced prison sentence. The first person implicated was another ring member named Ivan Boesky, aka the Russian. And you can guess what he did as well. For a reduced prison sentence, he implicated Martin Siegel, another Drexel employee. And all of this eventually led down to the door of the king himself, Michael Milken. As part of the plea deal with the SEC, Boesky agreed to pay a $100 million fine and serve time in prison. He also agreed to testify against Milken. In March 1989, Milken was indicted on 98 counts of racketeering, security fraud, mail fraud, and tax evasion charges. The case was brought together by someone who we all know very well, federal prosecutor at the time, Rudy Giuliani. After a lengthy trial, Milken reached a plea bargain in which he pleaded guilty to 6 felonies of securities fraud. As part of the deal, prosecutors dropped the insider trading charge. Milken eventually would be sentenced to 10 years in prison and permanently barred from the securities industry by the SEC. The sentence still sparked controversy, as many viewed it as overly lenient given the scale of the crimes. Some cited Milken's prominence and wealth as the reason for the life punishment. However, the judge stated the sentence reflected Milken's cooperation and the fact that his crimes were quote-unquote victimless. The plea deal also required Milken to pay a whopping $600 million in fines and restitution. Needless to say, all of this destroyed Drexel's reputation beyond repair. The firm declared bankruptcy in 1990. While the demise of Drexel, Burnham, and Lambert was triggered by the insider trading scandal, many also blamed the firm's overly aggressive junk bond strategy pursued under Milken's leadership. But the story for Milken does not end here, and he refused to fade into oblivion. After cooperating with the feds and providing testimony against his former colleagues, he was released after serving 22 months in prison. And from there on, he focused his energies on altruistic endeavors and medical research. In 1991, he founded the Milken Institute, an independent economic think tank. Apart from publishing research papers, the Institute organizes the annual Global Conference that invites the who's who of Wall Street, government, and beyond, and is held at the Beverly Hills Hilton in Los Angeles with nearly 3,000 people in attendance. He also co-founded philanthropic organizations like the Prostate Cancer Foundation, the Milken Family Foundation, and Faster Cures, dedicating over $1 billion to accelerate life-saving treatments. Further down the road, the SEC again accused Milken of violating his lifetime ban by offering advice to people like Rupert Murdoch and Ronald Perelman. He had also advised Ted Turner on selling his CNN business to Time Warner, for which he received a cool $50 million. Milken settled with the SEC complaint for $47 million in 1998. However, no new criminal charges were brought against him. Beyond this, Milken had been hard at work to get a presidential pardon the moment he served his sentence. And he had some influential backers in this effort, including people like Kevin McCarthy, Rupert Murdoch, David Rubenstein, and shockingly, the guy who got him convicted in the first place, Rudy Giuliani. This pardon eventually happened in February 2020 when President Donald Trump granted it to him. This again stirred significant debate, with proponents arguing Milken's philanthropy warranted forgiveness, while critics saw preferential treatment for a wealthy financier. Whether this philanthropy was plain eyewash or Milken's sincere efforts to make amends for his past behavior, we will never know. What we do know, though, that through his philanthropy he maintained a legion of supporters who clamored for his pardon for years. Despite giving away such huge sums in fines and settlements, Don't be concerned about Milken losing the shirt off his back anytime soon. According to some sources, he is worth at least $6 billion. Needless to say, he's not going to bed hungry just yet.